webinar. So we'll start that recording now. Whoops. And just so you'll have it available off of the website in the future too. There's a lot of wonderful material that we'll be sharing with you today. So we wanted to get a recording of that. And then our agenda for today, we're going to start off with our partners at the California Department of Education. Julia and Eileen are going to talk about planning for social emotional learning and their CDE projects. Then we're going to segue to some folks from the California PBIS Coalition who are also on the CDE work group for social emotional learning. Audra, Felicia, and Natalie will talk about integrating PBIS into social emotional learning framework. And then our key presenter for today is Dr. Karen Ward from the University of North Carolina National Implementation Research Network. And once again, all the materials can be found at our website under current events and chat, as well as Luke posted that in the chat room. And then finally, a shameless commercial. Please save the date, September 13th through the 15th. We are going to have our California PBIS conference in Sacramento. I'm pretty confident we have the green light. And as folks are getting vaccinated, it looks like we'll be open and able to have a conference. It's not going to look all crowded like that is in the middle. We'll be socially spaced out, so don't panic. But we will be together, and that will just be wonderful. So I'd like to turn it over to my friends and partners from the California Department of Education, Eileen and Julia.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. On behalf of the California Department of Education, I want to thank Mike and his team at the California PBIS Coalition for this opportunity to collaborate with Dr. Karen Ward from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and our colleagues from the state SEL team. So, as you know, social and emotional learning is a hot topic. Although the events of 2020 have highlighted the need to provide social and emotional support to students, as an educational community, we have long realized the importance of providing SEL. We know that when research-based SEL programming is implemented well, it raises student performance, reduces the risk for failure, it leads to higher academic achievement, better social emotional skills, improved attitudes about self, others, and school, and positive classroom behavior. And as reported in a recent research brief from Penn State University and the Robert Wood Foundation, there is an 11-to-1 return on investment in SEL. And Julia will be sharing that link to that research brief in the chat. So as experienced educators and educational leaders, you're also aware that implementing any new program requires planning and an active implementation strategy. This is especially true of SEL, the antithesis of one and done training. We are so grateful to Dr. Ward to share her tools with you all today. But before we begin, Julia Agostinelli, Education Programs Consultant in my office, would like to share some of the resources that you can find on the CDE website to support SEL in your own unique contexts.
Thanks, Elaine. As a member of the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning, or CASEL's Collaborating States Initiative, the CDE convened an SEL state team for the first time in 2016. The team was comprised of representatives from more than 20 California educational organizations and agencies. Team members represented diverse perspectives across education, SEL, school climate and culture, child development, expanded learning, equity, social justice, and other related fields. Over the course of a couple of years, the state SEL team developed two documents, the two that you see on your screen. The first was the SEL Guiding Principles, designed to build on the implicit and explicit SEL practices already happening in many schools, and to promote the intentional use of evidence and research-based practices to guide decision-making. The guiding principles seek to empower local stakeholders to continue to advance SEL in ways that meet the needs of their specific contexts and populations. The second document is SEL in California, a guide to resources. The guide highlights toolkits and online resource centers rather than standalone tools. Multiple resources offer guidance on a systemic approach to SEL implementation and continuous improvement processes in a variety of educational settings, which align to the spirit of the SEL guiding principles. I recommend taking time to read through them if you have not yet done so. In June of 2020, the CDE convened our new state SEL team, made up of educators from similarly diverse educational environments. And you'll get to hear from some of them today during this presentation. The purpose of the new team is threefold: provide policy recommendations in support of SEL, set additional resources that reflect the changes in SEL over the last few years, and finally develop state SEL competencies. We anticipate this work to be completed by July of this year. You'll find these resources and more on that CDE SEL webpage, which I'll put into the chat shortly. If you'd like to receive updates from the CDE about California's SEL efforts, please sign up for our listserv by sending a blank message to join-sel-planning@mlist.cde.ca.gov. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @CDE_SEL. And to view archived SEL newsletters, visit the California Educators Together SEL Newsletter Archive Collection. And I'll also add that link in the chat. If you have any questions regarding CDE SEL efforts, please contact myself or Elaine. Thank you again to Mike and the California PBIS Coalition team for bringing us all together today.
Thank you so much, Julia and Eileen. And I'm going to turn it over to our partners now from the PBIS Coalition and the SEL work group. Stop sharing and okay, take it away, guys.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Singleton, and I am from the San Diego County Office of Education. I am the Director of System of Supports in the Student Services and Programs Division.
Hi, I'm Audra Casanova. I'm with the Stanislaus County Office of Ed. I'm a project coordinator there for MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support.
And Natalie Sedano, Prevention Intervention Lead Specialist with Desert Mountain SELPA within CA Help. Oh, Felicia, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Thank you. We're going to open up with the land acknowledgement, which is a formal or public recognition of the original stewards of the land in the United States and the connection to it. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort by recognizing and honoring the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people in the U.S. and their traditional territories. We acknowledge that wherever we reside, we are on historic homelands of the original inhabitants of the land. We pay respects to their elders past and present, acknowledge this legacy, and find inspiration from this land. And as we get settled into our webinar today, we just want to engage in what's called a welcoming ritual. So we want to check in and see how you're feeling. So we're going to launch a poll, and just for the sake of time, what quadrant do you find yourself falling in today? We know it's already after 2 o'clock here on the West Coast, and you may have already had a full day of meetings or teaching or meeting with families and parents. So where are you finding yourself today as we start this webinar? In the red quadrant, yellow, green, or blue? We just want to take a poll.
Looking like people are feeling pretty good today, Felicia. Our majority being 45% are in the green. 46, 24% yellow. Blue is 24%, And red is around 8% for today.
Thank you, Mike, for that update and that information. So again, this is not anything other than you can do this with your students or with your staff just to gauge where you need to be as either the facilitator or the teacher, to just gauge your audience and what their needs may be to help them successfully get through a meeting or a training or a class. Next slide, please. So we're just going to take a few seconds here to shake off. If you found yourself in a quadrant that was, frustrated or tired or not motivated, we're just going to take a few minutes to ground ourselves in today's workshop with breathing. And we know that COVID has brought a special type of COVID coworker. So we find our children at home or maybe caring for a parent. So we just want to give ourselves an opportunity to shake all of that off and then just be present today. So if you can just take a couple of deep breaths in a rhythm with the heart that's here on the screen. So exhale very deeply. And one more, inhale. And a deep exhale. So thank you for that. So as we get started today, we know we're here to learn or to hear about implementation science. So we wonder, why do we need implementation science? And this memo was shared with the PBIS folks at our conference by Kent McIntosh. And to me, it's funny, but it perfectly summarizes what we experience as school site folks or even district site folks. So here goes the memo. To school administrators from district administrators. In keeping with the new state initiative, this fall, we will be implementing an exciting new district initiative of SNI, or Shiny New Initiative, in place of LYI, last year's initiative. All professional development days previously scheduled for last year's initiative will be rescheduled as staff development for Shiny New Initiative. The $500 for release time and materials for last year's initiative will be discontinued and provided instead for Shiny New Initiative. By the way, you will need to create local Shiny New Initiative teams that meet weekly. The former members of your last year initiative team would be perfect for this new team. Your new Shiny New Initiative binders will be coming next week. Have a great year. So again, we read that as a way to just remind us that if you're here today, if you've been in education even one day prior to COVID, you know what it's like to get that shiny new binder, right? You go to a training and you take it back and you're ready to jump in. Well, today you're going to learn the importance of taking the time to get your system ready for successful implementation.
And what does that successful implementation look like? Thank you, Felicia, for that. Without a framework. And so see, we have this bike of many pieces, and we just don't know sometimes how they all fit, or again, in the world of education, we're notorious for acronyms. Again, just putting things together, trying to organize. And so really how to do that is putting a bike together. And here we have our bike with our frame. So if you think about it this way, it's really the idea of we need to have all these pieces for it to really work, for us to really take on our journey in education, with having that school leadership, with having implementation, with those effective interventions, with coaching, and again, having that team available to really use all of those tools, all of those components of the bike to continue on our journey. Now with SEL, we're looking at enhancements, as I like to call it here, for our bike, and various things that are coming along our way. So for instance, our new bike here has a child seat, right? If we're talking about family engagement. We have our water bottle there in the center representing our SEL, and really it's essential. It's just needed in everything we do in terms of learning our coping strategies, or things that really will support us in the long run. Within our basket there, we have our first aid, restorative practices, just again, filling our toolbox, of the many tools that are out there in education. We have our helmet, because when we talk about self-care, right, we're thinking about safety first for ourselves, and then again, being able to apply that to others in our work. And last but not least, cultural responsiveness, hence with our bike tassels, are really celebrating culture and celebrating our students and our staff. And so again, it's just a matter of how we look at it to really enhance, again, our educational journey. And so that comes down to looking at systems, and I'll tag Audra.
Thank you, Natalie. This is essentially a different way of looking at Natalie's bike analogy. Each systems, data, and practices working in tandem to ensure equitable outcomes, because ultimately, isn't that why we're really here? To improve the academic, social, emotional, and behavioral, and sometimes life outcomes for our students. When we are talking about systems, what does that really mean? Well, as district and site leaders, we're thinking about how are we ensuring that all staff are trained on whatever framework or practices we adopt. Are we taking a team-based approach, or do we have 6 different teams working in silos from those leftover shiny previous year's initiatives, yet working together to try to accomplish the same thing, but yet in silos? Why not merge those SEL and PBIS teams? In addition, are there implementation fidelity measures? When we say fidelity, we aren't asking you to take the pledge and drink the Kool-Aid, but rather, are you implementing the framework true to what the research indicates? Are you using the tool as it was intended to be used? Practices. Here's where we get to accessorize Natalie's bike. Based on cultural and contextual appropriateness, as the data indicates, are we selecting practices that meet our staff, student, and community needs? How might we meticulously and thoughtfully adopt practices that support our system? Selecting it not because it's the shiny new initiative, but rather as a practice that supports our system goals. Data. For those freshly merged PBIS, SEL, school culture and climate teams that are one now, data is your best friend. We have to think, are we utilizing a variety of data sets to inform the selection of our practices? Are we triangulating those data sets? Ones which include our community through things like community health indicators. A great example of utilizing data to inform decision-making would be if we surveyed our staff and students and somehow found that 0 to little trauma exist in this population. Why then would we adopt and invest in trauma-informed practices? Just because it's an evidence-based strategy or practice does not mean that it's the best fit for your site. Use data to assess. Finally, as we are engaged in this delicate balance of this integrated systemic approach, we employ our methods of improvement science. To some of us, the PDSA cycle may sound a little bit more familiar than improvement science, but essentially they're the same things. We do this to ensure that we are staying inquisitive and reflective. Here, we will see the explicit crosswalk showing that PBIS and SEL are not competing or shiny new initiatives, but they can and should work together to support efforts for systemic change and in an effort to create whole child compassionate approaches. While PBIS is a 3-tiered framework, SEL can be inserted into that first tier as a tier 1 support. Meanwhile, both aim to create a safe, welcoming school environment. They're focused on prevention, and they use data-informed practices as well. Before we delve too much into the crosswalk between PBIS and SEL, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what PBIS is or stands for, we wanted to make sure we take a brief moment to define those things. So PBIS is positive interventions and supports. According to the Center for PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and support is an evidence-based 3-tiered framework for improving and integrating all of the data, system, and practices affecting student outcomes every day. It is a way to support everyone, especially for some of those most marginalized populations, like students with disabilities, to create the kind of schools where all students are successful. PBIS is not a curriculum you purchase or something you learn during a one-day professional development training. Sorry, guys. It is a commitment to addressing student behavior through systems change. When it's implemented well, students achieve improved social and academic outcomes. So schools experience reduced exclusionary discipline practices, and school personnel feel more effective. Now, we definitely have a guideline or a blueprint for implementing PBIS. You can see here the school-wide PBIS tiered fidelity inventory, which I'll be referencing later today. Alrighty, so what the heck do we mean when we say SEL? Well, what we know for a fact is that there are 542 different definitions of SEL. I'm kidding, it may just seem like that. However, for the purpose of our time together, I invite you, the participants, to ground yourself in CASEL's 5 core competencies. I know that for me as a former classroom teacher, having those 5 core competencies, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making really helped to take me from this lofty, abstract notion of SEL to one that I could clearly define through measurable actions and outcomes. Okay, well, if you are anything like me, you may be thinking, what the heck are you talking about, Audra? I need some concrete examples of how PBIS and SEL, or PBIS-EL, as I like to call it, can work together. Well, you've come to the right show, guys. Taking a step back, remember when I talked just briefly about the importance of having a fidelity measure for implementation? As I mentioned, in PBIS land, we call that the tiered fidelity inventory, or the TFI. There are actually 15 features that make up tier 1. The feature I'm highlighting here is 1.3, behavioral expectations. 1.3 states that the schools have 5 or fewer positively stated behavioral expectations and examples by setting a location for students and staff behaviors defined and in place. What an amazing opportunity to integrate those 5 core competencies. A PBIS EL example. You can see here under the social, emotional, and behavioral expectations, we have those very SEL reminiscent expectations of being respectful, responsible, and safe. Looking further into the matrix, you have specific behaviors such as taking care of your materials as you transition in the hallway, which is an example of self-management. We can also see things like using kind language or social awareness, and taking short breaks from your seat and screen, responsible decision-making. Another opportunity for integrating is through the use of CASEL's 3 signature practices, which includes welcoming rituals like doing a feelings check-in as we did today at the beginning of class, engaging activities like a think, ink, pair, share, or an optimistic closure by ending your class with the students reflecting on their daily takeaways. So how might this present itself as a PBIS-EL integrated example? Again, remembering our TFI, we utilize feature 1.4, teaching expectations, which states expected academic and social behaviors, are taught directly to all students in classrooms and across other campus settings and locations. You can see this lesson plan where we explicitly teach the behavior expectations for the classroom. We've infused those signature practices with the use of the mood meter as a welcoming ritual, engaging activities, and a closing challenge as our optimistic closure. Additionally, you'll notice SEL competencies included in our matrix of what respectful, responsible, and safe mean. You know, if this year has taught us anything, it's that this is the time to strengthen and streamline our efforts. We can do this through this integrated approach. Remember to think smarter, not harder, and to take a team approach for the mental health and well-being of all. Felicia?
So the next slide, for the sake of time, you all have the slides, but I'm going to not read you this story. You have the California PBIS Coalition's social media handles and contact information. So this time I'm going to give it back to Mike so we can pass it to Karen.
Thank you so much. And as we transition to Dr. Ward, let me just say it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. I think everybody's going to find her presentation just captivating and essential for doing the work. I reflect back to Kent McIntosh's letter, Karen's going to teach us how to not chase after shiny new objects. I may print that out actually and post it right on my wall. So take it away, Karen.
Thanks so much, Mike, and for the team for the great introduction and the setup for today. I greatly appreciate it. In fact, they already have accomplished objective 1 for us today, which was really looking at that, explaining and connections between PBIS and social emotional learning. So thank you so much for that. I hope by the end of the next hour together that you'll be able to leave and be able to articulate why we're talking about implementation science. Why is that needing for supporting the use of social emotional learning evidence-based practices? I hope that you will be able to make connections between your current implementation methods and strategies. And I hope you are going to identify an implementation strategy and or tool to support your implementation of SEL practices going forward. I hope to leave you with links and resources by the end today as we dive in. So that's what we hope to accomplish in the next hour together. So what and why of implementation science? Let's dive into what. And we've been talking at you now for a little bit, and I love Kent McIntosh's scenario that was shared. So if you can think about that scenario in mind, in your own words, why do you think attending to implementation is important? Why is that important? And so if you could just think and write for a moment on a Post-it note or something in front of you, and then or type in the chat. And then if you'd be willing to share that in the chat, that would be great. Why is attending to implementation important? I hope some of you will engage with me here today. Thank you so much, Jared. Consistency and fidelity. Okay. Ooh, good one. Keeping us accountable.
I like Jackie's, if you're going to do something, do it well.
Exactly. Setting clear expectations, increasing participation. A lot of you are speaking my language here. Sustainability and effectiveness. Absolutely. Clear direction. So we're seeing data, fidelity. Thanks, Michelle. Expectations, clear processes, ways to evaluate, right? We need to be able to look at implementation in order to explain our outcomes. Just doing the same thing, not really knowing why. Oh, thanks, Susie. Presentation at a restaurant. It's important to be part. And I personally like restaurants that have a much smaller menu than like the gigantic menu when we think about quality control. Those are fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate you. I'm going to have polls and other opportunities through the chat today to engage you in this content as we go back and forth. So I really appreciate everybody jumping in and sharing. If you did not share, feel free to put it in as I keep moving on here, or give your thoughts as we go throughout. All right, so why implementation? I'm sure based on the responses in the chat, that many of you are familiar with this science to service gap or research to practice gap, where we see that we've spent a lot of time and energy and effort on identifying and researching what are those best practices, but we have not spent as much time and effort on really researching and understanding how do those translate into effective teaching and learning in real-world classroom settings. And what we see is this gap that occurs. Often what does get adopted isn't used with fidelity, or what we mean being used as intended or as originally developed. What is used with fidelity is not sustained. So we have that SNI, that shiny new initiative that comes along potentially, or we drift back to old practices. And what we do get used to fidelity, we struggle at times to take that to scale, right? So we can have these islands of excellence or pockets of excellence where we're seeing good things happening with fidelity, seeing outcomes, but maybe that's within a grade level or in a classroom within a school, or maybe that's within a school or two amongst a district, or within a few districts among a region, but not all. And that creates equity issues. for us and for our students and our families that we serve. We also know when we use any of the strategies alone here on the slide, they by themselves, so if we just provide money, or if we just pass a law, there's been a lot of mandates and legislation of late, or my personal favorite, if we just kind of reorganize ourselves, or we do that one-day training, that those by themselves do not result in the use of the practices or that innovation that we're trying to get implemented as intended. In fact, our return on investment on any one of those strategies by themselves is a 5 to 15%. So when we're thinking about our budgets, I don't want to give up. I don't want that type of return, right? I want to maximize that return and get the most that I can. So these are all very necessary strategies, but by themselves, not sufficient. So then what does work, right? So then that's where implementation science comes into play, where we look at that as a field to help give us effective strategies and tools to help bridge what we know, what works, into actual practice. Our definition of implementation science is there on the screen. It refers to the methods or the techniques used to enhance the adoption, the implementation, and the sustainability of an intervention. I encourage you to think more broadly than intervention. Sometimes when we use that term, our heads go to a multi-tiered system of support where we're thinking about targeted or intensive supports. Implementation, we're talking about implementation of practices, whether that's at a core level for all kids or at a more targeted or intensive. And we have to remind ourselves that implement means simply to use something, to put something into use. I also want to draw our attention that we need to ensure that implementation is equitable. And given the events within our country this past year, and maybe you've been like me and glued to the news alerts and trying to hear what's happening with the trial, what's happening there, we also know that we need to attend to equity. And this was a definition that NERN and in collaboration with the Annie Casey Foundation put out in 2019 of looking at equitable implementation. And we define that as occurring when strong equity components, meaning we're giving explicit attention to the culture, the history, the values, the assets, and the needs of the community, are integrated into the principles and the tools of implementation to ensure that we're getting the quality implementation for specific communities or groups of communities. So we want to make sure that we're attending to equity from the get-go within our implementation work, and that that's an equitable implementation approach. So we know what doesn't work, right? We've talked about why implementation science and what do we mean? What are these implementation practices? So at NERN and within our CSEP TA Center that we provide support for K-12, we look at active implementation as being 3 critical factors to getting to socially significant outcomes. And you saw these as I describe them and break them down. We saw these represented within the PBIS framework and how they talk about systems, practices, and data. And I love the addition of the PDSA cycle. So when we think about effective, we need three factors: effective practices, effective implementation, and enabling context in order to get to improved outcomes or socially significant outcomes. Our founders were very strategic in making that a multiplication formula, because if any one of those factors is missing or equivalent to 0, the potential for improvement on outcomes is 0, or if any one of those are weak. So let's break these down a little bit further as to what are the questions we're asking in each of these 3 factors. So when we think about effective practices, we're thinking about what is being implemented. What is the evidence for its effectiveness? Who is it for? Who is going to be using the practice? How well operationalized is the practice so that I can teach it, I can learn it, you can do it, and we can assess whether it's happening. And how can we ensure that we know what is adaptable given our local context and still maintain fidelity? When we're thinking about effective implementation, we're thinking about these questions in guiding our work. How does implementation progress over time? How do we make sure that we're building a sustainable infrastructure, training, coaching, data systems, resource allocation, the leadership supports to support use of the practice and achieve fidelity. We're looking at how do we use data for improvement purposes and to communicate about our work. And we're always attending to how do we transition the supports if they're being provided externally from an expert or a purveyor to ensure that we have the capacity being built internally for sustainability. And when we think about the enabling contacts, we're wanting to ask these questions. How are we engaging stakeholders in supporting implementation throughout the process from start to finish? And how are we using that data for improvement in learning and creating that culture of learning as we go forward? Now that all sounds great and very technical, we have to remember there's also human beings. Implementation is about changing the adults' hearts, minds, and behaviors within the system. And so we have to remember that that requires change on our part. And often there's differing levels of readiness for the change. I just love this visual so much of this little girl. Some of us are quite ready and at the end of that diving board and ready for summer and to jump in for that change. We may have others that we're working with in our organization or in our system that are contemplating that change, right? They're standing at the end of the stairs looking up, thinking about getting on board with us and climbing up that platform. And then we may have others that are not even on the pool deck and maybe they are looking into the fence, maybe considering it, or you may have others that have their back turned to the fence, to the pool deck. So we also need to ensure in our implementation work that we're attending to those hearts, minds, and behaviors, and that we are creating readiness for the work ahead. So what I'd like to do today is share a little bit about how through a case illustration, we put these particular factors to life through the use of what we call the active implementation frameworks. For effective practices, we talk about how do we select practices. For effective implementation, we talk about what activities are needed when in implementation, called the stages. The drivers is that infrastructure, right? The training, the coaching, the data systems, the leadership supports. And for enabling contacts, we talk about that implementation is not a one-person solo hero journey. For it, it's about having a teaming structure, and that teaming structure needs to be a linked teaming structure between the state, the regional, your county offices, the district level, and the school level. And if you're a large urban district, you might have multiple levels within your district as well. And then finally, how do we use plan, do, study, act cycles for continuous improvement systematically and purposefully so that we can change on purpose, all in service to getting to socially significant outcomes. So again, want to give you a chance to reflect and take a breath here. So I'd like you to reflect for a moment on your current or maybe a previous work of implementation related to social emotional learning or PBIS or a combination of both, as you might be decorating your bike. And I'd like you to answer the following poll that we are going to have pop up here and there's going to be 3 questions in it. Did you have an identified practice in that implementation work? Did you have effective implementation strategies in use? Did you have an enabling context? So we're looking to see how well was that formula represented in your work. So go ahead and take a moment, reflect, answer those questions. And then if you'd be willing to share in the chat, what was one factor that was successful for you? Maybe you had a really strong team, you had a well-defined practice, or maybe there was something that was missing, right? Maybe you didn't have the right data at the right time, or maybe that practice wasn't so well defined. If you could share that in the chat box as well, that would be great.
Thank you, Karen. While folks share out, I just wanted to let everybody know that the recording will be shared on our webpage in a few days. We've had some questions about that.
Thanks, Mike. So it looks like by the poll results coming in like a strong majority of folks in saying, yes, we had an identified effective practices, over 86% right now. We've got fewer folks saying they had effective implementation strategies, but still over 50%. We're sitting at about 69% right now. And we're like 50-50 on the enabling contacts of between 49% saying yes and 52% saying no. So keep those numbers coming in. And I love to see some of the chats starting to come in. So we've got strong teams, strong practices, the team, same expectations. That's fantastic. Admin support. Nana, thanks for sharing. Good team took data, but the use of the data was needing to be strengthened. District level support for the ongoing implementation support and coaching that's needed. Layers of team was key. Monthly site teams, having district leadership team members being trained. Enabling context is huge. All caps and an exclamation mark. If teams are not building competency and using the data. Oh, I'm so glad. Samantha, thank you so much for saying coaching. I was hoping coaching was going to come in there. And with feedback being key. Okay, it looks like we have about half of you have voted. So we'll just do one more minute and then we're going to keep going. Site coach is missing. Oh, one person for 54 campuses. If anybody wants me to, I'll share with you what the ratio is in the literature. That is way, way off based on our recommendations. Registered behavioral technicians to implement interventions and collect data. This is great. So we got about 54% have voted. I'd like to get to 60 if I can. If I can have a few more people vote. Got site teams. Bridget, you raised your hand. Do you want to drop it in the chat, or would you like, or are you able to come off mute? Mike, how does that work for on this when you all are running this?
If she would, to put it in the chat would be the best way to ask the question in the chat.
Thanks, Bridget. If you don't mind doing that, that would be great. All right, we got up to 56%. I guess we'll call it. Want to be careful of time here. So if we can go ahead and end that poll and we'll share the results. So we can, thanks, Bridget. You can see where we were in terms of the findings there about most folks felt like they had that strong practice in place at 89%. The majority of folks felt they had good strategies in use. Hopefully I'll maybe give you a tidbit today that you can take away and strengthen that. And enabling context. So teams and use of data is where we've got that 50-50 split occurring. All right, so what I'd like to do is to then walk through implementation and action of an SEL case illustration for a school district that was going through improvement work. And they decided to strengthen their SEL work and kind of look at the application of key implementation strategies within certain key times of implementation, what we call the implementation stages, as we go through. So let's dive in. So here we have a large urban district in the Midwest. You can see the demographic makeup there of their population. And they're, for example, 60% meet criteria for free and reduced lunch, 20% receive services as an English learner, 17% receive services for special education. It's a bit higher than the state average. And you can also see their racial breakdown there of 35% Black, 35% white, 17 Hispanic or Latino, And then we get into smaller percentages such as their Asian and American Indian populations. When we think about starting an implementation, we have 4 discrete stages of implementation. No matter what implementation science framework you look at, there's over 25 of them published. We pretty much all agree on one consistent piece, that there are 4 stages to implementation. Sometimes installation gets called planning, but basically the functions are the same. So in exploration, this is the stage at which you're really forming a team that is hopefully diverse, representative of your district, and you're assessing your needs and your assets. You're identifying potential options to address what you identify as that need. We're going to examine the fit and feasibility of those options, and we're going to make a selection of the practice. We're also in exploration, really starting to communicate and engage our stakeholders in each of those steps and build readiness for the implementation work. So that's that first stage that we're going to talk through. You're going to see then and what the district did at each stage as we go through here. And then we're going to go into installation, initial implementation, and into full implementation. And a really key piece here that we like to say is that through each stage, we're attending to data usage for continuous improvement as we go through. I should also say that those stages look really nice and linear, and they're anything but linear. You'll see that infinity symbol is behind there. And that is on purpose because we can go back and forth between stages. So we could get into installation and need to go back and revisit some activities within exploration. Or we might be in initial implementation for one SEL practice, and maybe we are in exploration for our literacy work. So we can be in stages, different stages for different practices. So just keep that in mind as we go through today, and let's dive first into what this district did in exploration as they went through. So, and I think this is going to be familiar to many of you. Within their exploration stage, they first kind of assess their need and examine their system. I think what California often calls a system investigation stage, where they had looked at multiple sources of disaggregated data, and the results revealed they had significant gaps in assessment data. Their graduation rates were declining, and their climate surveys were showing low level of parent engagement and students feeling not connected to school was what they were seeing. So they had an area of focus that got identified of specifically looking at the secondary level and graduation rates. When they look at their disaggregated data, they particularly were concerned for Native American students and African American student populations when they looked at those disaggregation data. So with that in mind, they adjusted their team membership to make sure the right representation there. And they also wanted to gather more stakeholder perspective and input and student voice onto what was happening with that data, what could be contributing, what are contributing factors, as well as to gather more information to identify what could be the underlying root cause. So they conducted focus groups and some empathy interviews with families, with students, and some community partners. They also did a staff survey to get some additional information as well. From there, they looked at doing a root cause analysis, and they used 2 tools in that process. They looked at a fishbone diagram to look at what could be potential contributing factors. And then they also did a 5 whys, right, where they asked why 5 times as they went through. And where they landed in their root cause was that students do not feel trust or feel connected to staff to reach out for help or assistance when needed. So they've got their focus, they've got their team formed, they're beginning to communicate about this work with stakeholders. They have looked at their initial data review, examined their system, and did some root cause analysis and landed at this for graduation rates with what was happening. From there, they then said, okay, let's stop and look at what options do we have available to address this need. They did 2 key activities from implementation. One is they examined practices that they currently had in place through the use of an initiative inventory, or what sometimes gets called a working smarter but not harder grid and matrix, or maybe an environmental scan. And when they took a scan of what practices that were currently in place and happening, they found that they have an early warning intervention system, but there are some issues with it in terms of the data that it provides. And they also had a variety of counseling programs that were in action at the secondary level by their counselors and school psychologists and some other related staff. They also then did the step of saying, okay, that's what we've got in place. What does the research say? And to do that, they looked at the What Works Clearinghouse. And through looking at that review of potential programs, they identified, and I de-identified it for the purpose of this, the mentoring and monitoring program, the M&M program from the clearinghouse, and looked at that data. From there, they looked at, as they made that choice to look at the mentoring program a bit further, they did that by looking at, from a priority standpoint, what would give them some high impact and what would be the level of effort that would be needed for implementation to kind of help prioritize that for further exploration. Okay, but they didn't just say, okay, M&M is it, and we're off and on. They also then stopped and said, okay, let's assess how well it fits with what we're doing. But before we go there, I have another poll for you as I tell this story. I'm curious, how do you keep track of what practices you have currently happening within your district or within your school and their level of implementation? Have you used an initiative inventory or a working smarter but not harder matrix? And then once you answer the poll, if you're sharing the chat, what do you see as a benefit of potentially using an initiative inventory or a matrix such as that? So right now, 72% have not used an initiative inventory or working smarter, not harder. Mike, is there any chance you can drop in the chat the link to the initiative inventory on the NERN site? Jared helps get rid of.
I'm working on it.
Thanks, Mike. Yep, Jody, it would help you narrow your focus. Jared, you're spot on. Having an initiative inventory is a way to help make room for the work. I love to quote George Sagai, and I'm with my PBIS friends today. We say at SysEP the law of Sagai, which is for every new thing that you ask a teacher to do or a school to do, you need to take 2 things off their plate. We call that the law of George Sagai, the law of Sagai. Yeah, Deanna, look at what you're using, what is no longer working. Gets the big picture onto the screen. It absolutely does. Yep, law of Sagai. For every new thing you ask, take 2 things off the plate or stop what you're doing. And the initiative inventory can give you that information as to what you're not going to do, what you can stop doing, or how do you make room. Because the initiative inventory gathers information such as what team is leading that initiative? How are you measuring whether it is working or not? Who is that? Where is that practice or initiative being used? What data do you have to support its effectiveness? Is it a mandated initiative? Is it something that your legislation, your state or at the regional level or district board is a mandate? What are the funding sources that come with that, that you're using to support the work of that initiative? That's all great information that when you complete an initiative inventory, it creates like a database, right? And then once you have it, you can add to it over time. And if you go to that link there on the AI Hub, we also recently published in collaboration with Colorado Department of Ed. They created an analysis process, really sweet, for how you analyze the initiative inventory, not only to make deselection decisions, but also to look at alignment decisions. And so within that Colorado version of the initiative inventory, there's also tools that we worked with CDE with Colorado Department of Ed on how, on to look at that alignment between initiatives, which was very sweet. So if you take one thing away from today, I hope it's either the stages tool that I'm going to share in a bit, or the initiative inventory, or the Hexagon, and give it a try. It will change your life, I promise, if you can figure out how to make room for work. So thank you so much for engaging in the survey. We're at 67%. I say we take it and share those results. It looks like only 28% of you have used an initiative inventory. Please check it out. Like I said, it will help you make room for work. All right, so they have, let's go back to our River School District here. They have identified the M&M program potentially for use, but they didn't just say, yes, let's go. They also stopped to really examine the fit and feasibility of that program within their district potentially. And they did that through the use of the Hexagon tool. And the Hexagon tool guides them to gather additional information around 6 particular factors that from the implementation literature tells us are really important to consider when making an adoption or making a decision to put resources behind something. And the goal of it is that you have so much information come out of it to inform a selection or a deselection that it then also helps with your implementation planning. It's going to zero you in on where do you need to strengthen and get ready for that implementation. So the 6 factors it guides you in considering is, 1, how well does it address the need that you're considering? What is the level of evidence behind that practice or the program? How does it fit with your community values, the culture, the other practices or programs that you have going on? Sometimes we'll add a practice and not realize that we're unintentionally hurting another practice by adding that new practice in. They may not fit together well. And then often who that falls on to do so is the classroom teacher or that implementer, that staff member, and it shouldn't have to fall on them to figure out how they fit. Often when that falls on them to figure out how it fits, one practice ends up getting abandoned. Had that happen in my own kids' elementary school, back to school night, they'd been a blue ribbon school for PBIS for years. They became a magnet school in downtown Raleigh. They got extra money associated with becoming a downtown school. They decided they would go to this fancy new training. And so they put the money into a new training, spent a new teacher, sent a few teachers. They came back, it's back to school night. I'm all ready. They're explaining this new program and I'm going, this doesn't sound like it's going to work well. So I raised my hand. I'm like, so how is this working with like your school-wide expectations and with your reinforcement system? And the teacher goes, Karen, I have no idea. Can you go talk to Mark, the administrator, about that? I'm just trying to get through tonight. So anybody want to guess what their office discipline referral and expansion and data look like that year? Not good. Fidelity to PBIS went down and they did not implement that new practice with fidelity either. And the data showed it. So unfortunately, that's a non-example. I wish they had done this and I am that parent that gave a little bit of a mouthful on this. So anyway, back to this. So you want to examine fit. You also want to look at how usable, right? How well defined is that program? Does it come with a fidelity measure? Does the practice give guidance on how what you can adapt and when in your implementation with keeping fidelity? And then the final 2 factors is we want to look at capacity and supports. So what is our capacity in terms of our staffing, our financially, our physical space, the procedure, the resources and procedures that are going to be needed to enable the use of that program or practice? And then what are the supports that are available to it that we have maybe from the developer, from an expert group, your county office, or from the state, as an example. So the Hexagon tool gives questions to consider each of those factors. And our team here at the River School District went through that, and they made the recommendation to go ahead and select. But out of that process came 3 important things for their planning. One, that they knew they were going to have to strengthen their local capacity. There were some staffing things that they were going to have to do. They also knew they had to strengthen the usability of that program. It came with a whole fidelity of implementation manual, but didn't have a fidelity measure. So they knew they were going to have to create a way of measuring, was it happening as intended? And they wanted to leverage the EWIM system, the early warning intervention and monitoring system, but they had found through this that it wasn't providing the right data and the data wasn't timely. So they were going to need to work with the developer of that to get that fixed in order to support their implementation. So I have another poll for you. What factors do you consider when selecting a program or practice? And if we get the poll up, you're going to see the 6 factors listed. You can choose more than one. I hope you do. Which factors do you most consider? And if you consider other factors in your decision making, feel free to drop those in the chat. So need is winning out. We got 44, 40, 50%, 58% of folks saying need. Evidence is the next one, but it's like 10%. Usability is that 3rd one there. Oh, Chanel, you can only choose one? All right, I'm so sorry. Oh, I was hoping we'd be able to choose all that apply. I must not have been clear in my directions. Sorry about that. So if you have other factors that you consider, feel free to drop those or off that list in the chat as well. So, but it looks like that the top one is need, but there may be others that you're considering too. All right, we can go ahead and end the poll and share those results. So with only being able to check one, I'm curious. Did anybody wish to have the option as to what my neighboring district is doing? Awesome, folks put capacity in and usability. Thanks, Erin. And I wish I could see some of you or see some head nodding. There was a survey that was done of superintendents, and this was mostly in the Midwest part of the country. But what they found was the #1 factor in superintendents or chief academic officers' decision-making on adoption of practices was whether or not the neighboring district was doing it. So sometimes we have folks with the Hexagon say, you know, it's the social social influence factor there as you go through. So please think about how you consider those 6 factors to make a selection or a deselection. That's a bell ringer in our world. We love when the Hexagon gets used to make room for work and to deselect something in your decision making. And I promise now, when you go to buy your next car or that next laundry machine, you'll be thinking about those 6 factors because they apply in those decisions as well. So thank you for engaging in that poll with me. Okay, so we've now worked through the work of exploration, right? They've identified they want to go forward with the M&M program. They've identified where they're going to need to focus some of their efforts on in implementation. So once you've made a decision to go, you're in what we call the installation stage. It's the planning stage. It's where the team is developing the training, the coaching, the data systems. They're ensuring the leadership supports are in place. They're selecting their first group of implementers, their first cohort of implementers to get, and their training is happening in installation of that first group of implementers. And they're also saying this is the decision-making criteria for when we're going to expand our use of the program, when we're ready to go to the second cohort of implementers. That's also a key activity of installation. So let's look at what River School District did here. So in installation, they mutually selected a small number of schools. And I'm going to give you a piece of data point for why that mutual selection is so important. They secured the necessary training supports from a trainer. Remember I told you they identified that need for a fidelity measure. So they made some plans for how they were going to work with the the provider on how they could start to, what would be a fidelity measure. They supported development of the school-based secondary school leadership teams that was going to be accountable for the implementation. They used state aid funds that were available for hiring 2 mentors and a coordinator that was needed in addition to some existing staff. And they identified and made improvements to that early warning intervention system as they went through. Why mutual selection of participating sites is so important. So this was a study that was done by Romney. And if you do not engage in mutual selection, meaning that you're creating readiness, there's a shared understanding of what the expectations are, you have clear criteria for that selection, and you've got that understanding of what it's going to take. If you skip that, and let's say you just voluntold people or assign folks to the implementation, the cost per practitioner is about 7 to 8 times higher than when you have mutual selection. Look at the difference in the cost there. It could cost you $7,811 per practitioner, or do you like the cost of $1,052 per practitioner or implementer? So I personally like the $1,000. I like to hit it hopefully from the start. And so we really want to think about mutual selection and attending to that readiness that is needed in exploration and how that is so very, very critical as we go through. So they did all that work in installation. They were planning, they were figuring out who the trainer was going to be. They allocated funding sources. They did the hiring. They got those folks trained. When the practice goes into use, we're then considered an initial implementation. So when those schools, when those mentors started to engage in the M&M practice, they were in initial implementation. And this is where we're really seeing data's flowing all the way throughout, but we're really using data here for continuous improvement with looking at that training effectiveness data, collecting that fidelity data with the measure that they developed to be able to use. And they're running PDSA cycles, plan, do, study, act cycles on how improvements are needed to the implementation supports being provided. A key thing to remember about initial implementation, it's like your first pancake off the griddle. Does anybody know how that first pancake usually comes off the griddle? If anybody likes to cook pancakes, they usually get made every weekend at my house. That very first pancake, right? If you think about it, it's not the prettiest. Thanks, Elena. It's not, right? It's usually burnt around the edges and it might still be gooey in the middle, right? Or overcooked, right? So, and who usually has to eat that first pancake in your house, right? It's usually the cook or it's the dog. Those are usually the responses I get, right? You have to think about initial implementation. Those first group of practitioners and the use of the practice is like our first pancake off the griddle. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be perfect. And that's because the infrastructure, the griddle underneath that pancake is not yet fine-tuned to perfection, right? We don't quite yet have it at the right temperature. We're having to maybe lower it a little bit, maybe turn it up a little bit, like get it to that griddle to the right temperature. It's the same when we're implementing in districts and schools, right? We need to make sure that our training is solid. We want to make sure that the coaching is going well, that feedback, those follow-up supports, that the right resources are being allocated where they're needed. Policies and procedures are being changed in order to enable use of the practice, right? That's all the work of initial implementation, is getting that infrastructure, the griddle, to be at the right temperature. And too often we get that first pancake as the result. And instead of fiddling with the griddle, we throw out that pancake and we go on to the shiny new initiative, right? So, or we drift back to our old way of work. So we consider this the most fragile stage of implementation because it is the absolute messiness, right? So we want to stick with it. So in thinking about that first pancake off the griddle, right, in the River School District, students began receiving the M&M program. The team was regularly reviewing and analyzing fidelity data, trying to get that flowing. They had to do rapid improvements to that fidelity data, that fidelity measure over time. They were monitoring who was being served, right? Like which kids were able to access the M&M program. And they were looking at the progress monitoring data of attendance, grades, discipline, and they were keeping a pulse on student voice by continuing to do some survey work and empathy interviews. And they identified changes that were needed, that they were testing. Like they figured, if you look at that year one data, only they went from 41% on their fidelity data to 44%, right, on the measure they created. So they had some work to do, right? So they realized they did not have the right coaching supports or feedback in place for mentors. So they had to put that in place. They made adjustments to the master schedule to enable kids to actually be able to meet with their mentor and for the time that was needed. And they continued to work with the EWIM system to make sure it was giving the right data at the right times when relevant in order to support. And they also made some connections in the community in terms of some wraparound supports that were needed for students. So you can see in year two, with improvements that they were making, they did not throw out that first pancake, right? They didn't drop M&M, but they went in, their fidelity data rose significantly and they got to 95%. I can also tell you they had a huge increase in the percentage of African-American and Native American students with disabilities that graduated. The increase in year one, they had about 70% of kids graduating, and from year that received the practice, and that jumped up to 85% of kids that received the practice that were graduating. So initial implementation, the messy stage, you got to stick with it. I just want to go back for a minute. Full implementation, we meet that when we've got at least 50% or more of our intended practitioners, the implementers, using the practice, and we're using data to continuously improve outcomes, right? And that will take a good 2 to 4 years based on the data to get to there. So we're in an initial implementation for a little bit of time, and that's where we're using that data ongoing for continuous supports. All right, I am running out of time here. So let me wrap up and get you thinking for the day. I want to leave you with one of our favorite algorithms that we reference by Wexelblatt. And he said he was an aeronautical engineer in the 1960s working with NASA when he came up with this algorithm. And it is so very true and applies to more than building space shuttles. He says that you can have 2 of the following 3. You can only have 2 out of cheap, fast, and good. In your implementation work, if you want fast and good, it's not going to be cheap. Okay. If you want to be able to move at a timeline, right, and have quality work, it's certainly not going to be cheap. If you want cheap, if you don't want to have to put the resources into it and you want it to be quality, it's not going to be fast, right? Implementation takes time. And if you want cheap and fast, it's not going to be good, right? That's getting into that initial implementation and not skipping exploration or the critical installation work that is needed. So I always have Wexelblatt in my mind. Are we going cheap and good? And I know that's not going to be fast. Or are we going fast and good and it won't be cheap? The third option, I always try to keep that out of my head when engaging in implementation planning. I do want to leave you with a tool. This was a revised tool. We significantly overhauled this tool. It's called the Implementation Stages Planning Tool, formerly called Where Are We Now? And it has two resources for you. It first has a flow chart to help you say, wait, what stage of implementation are we in? By asking some key questions. So it will guide you to what stage you're in. And then once you figure out what stage you're in, for each stage, there is a checklist of activities, critical activities that are needed for implementation. And there's key resources that are hyperlinked in the different activities. So for example, in exploration, not only do you want to grow your team and relationships with stakeholders, but you also want to cultivate sponsors and champions of your work. There's been several meta-analysis published in 2020 on how important sponsors and champions are in implementation. So there's a link there to resources. You also, in this checklist, you'll see that you can just check, we haven't yet initiated this, or it's in progress, or you'll see there's a third option of we're in continuous improvement. And the reason why we had it added that third option of continuous improvement is because if you remember, you can always come back and revisit previous stage activities to make improvements based on what you're learning in your current work. And then the final piece I want to point out in the resource is for each stage, we also identify what are key outcomes that should be being accomplished by that stage. So in exploration here, as an example, you want to have a core team formed. You want to have that demonstrated need for the practice. You want to be able to have that practice selected and starting to get acceptability and buy-in from your stakeholders and staff. And then we also put key tips and things to remind about different stages. Then I also want to make sure Mike's done a fantastic job dropping in links throughout. And Mike, I so appreciate you and thank you. But if you want to learn more about implementation, you can go to the Active Implementation Hub, where we have a plethora of tools and resources, all free, publicly available, paid for by the U.S. Department of Ed. And before I go to the exit ticket, since we have about 10 minutes left, I just want to stop and see if there are any questions about the case study that we walked through in the application of different implementation activities. Any questions in the chat that I've missed?
Folks, feel free to post questions in the chat now if you like. We have some additional time.
Mike, I was so worried about time that I then gave us some time back.
Well, we have a good chance for dialogue now.
Yeah.
So
And if you're thinking about that question, I also put up the exit ticket for today. I love exit tickets as a quick formative to let me know, did I pique your interest? Do you want to go learn something more? So maybe you'll share in the chat one strategy or tool that you might be interested in further exploring. Maybe it's that initiative inventory, maybe the Hexagon, maybe the stages planning tool, as some examples. Mike, do you have a favorite while we're waiting for folks to maybe put a question in the chat?
I do. I think the initiative inventory is probably my favorite because it helps, us really think about what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Is it being effective? And in California, and I believe most of the participants today are from California, the initiative inventory coupled with our local control plan, so our LCAP plan, accountability plan, is a great way to use an executive summary for your LCAP when we start doing those again next year.
Absolutely. Oh, so we did get some questions in the chat. I'm trying to scroll through them. The recommended coach to site ratio you mentioned. So when you go to the coaching literature, they don't give you a hardcore number. So where we've gone is looking into the human organizational literature. And when you go there, if we think about units, right, we like to think about 1 to 3 to 4 units. So like 1 coach to maybe 3 to 4 schools, and thinking about ratios and number of implementers. So I hope that's helpful, Jared, but that's where that's coming from. Heidi said, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Heidi, how would you suggest bringing these tools to overloaded district administrators as a starting point? Oh, great question, right? It's COVID. We're like swamped with bringing kids back into campuses right now and planning for the year. I totally get it, and I'm with you. I think timing is everything, right? And being at the opportune moment. And so I think about using the rationales. Okay, well, with everything going on, is there any opportunity for us to work smarter and not harder here? So for example, if we're getting some money in, maybe you're getting some COVID dollars in, and could we say, can we take a stop and see what we're currently doing that maybe we need to use that money to strengthen our implementation work? Or do we need to really evaluate maybe that using the Hexagon as some 6 factors that we should look at systematically and making that decision on how we should allocate resources? That might be like 2 examples of how I would start to integrate it in just in time, just enough, so not to overwhelming them. But I open it to Mike and some of the other panelists if they have other thoughts on that one.
Colleagues from the PBIS Coalition have anything to add, or the Department of Ed? It's a quiet bunch on a Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah. We've got another question in there. If there's not any additional, one is from Elena. When you're in initial implementation phase, how do we respond to admin that is hesitant to continue with the program because the progress improvement may not be as great as hoped? So Elena, and I didn't put it in here because we only had so much time. So this to me is all about how do you help them see the value in implementation data, and really understanding that you have to have enough of a presence and a strength of the innovation in use, meaning that you want to have a certain percent of your practitioner, your staff, your implementers using the practice with fidelity to start to expect to see outcomes, right? If you don't have that at fidelity and you're interpreting that the program is not working, you're doing what statisticians call a type 3 error. You're trying to measure something that does not yet exist. It's not a strong enough presence to demonstrate its impact. So we need to look at our attention on how is fidelity and other implementation data improving before drawing those conclusions that the program itself is not working. That's where I go in mine with looking at that question. I hope that's helpful. I see my panelists are shaking heads, so maybe they agree with me on that one.
Definitely. I'm reviewing the chat box too, and it seems like the initiative inventory and the Hexagon tool were absolutely big hits. I noticed a shout out for the bicycle analogy to my PBIS colleagues.
I love that
example. And I'm particularly fond of the new bicycle with the wagon and the first aid. And that is the best picture of social emotional learning, scaffold to PBIS in the framework.
Yeah. And Mike, if folks want to learn more about the Hexagon tool, like on how to conduct a selection process using the Hexagon, or they want to learn how to use the initiative inventory, on that AI Hub website, if you go to the lessons page, we released 2 brand new lessons over the last year, interactive lessons on how to engage in a Hexagon, use the Hexagon, and then how to conduct an initiative inventory. I'll warn you, it's interactive. So it's like gaming technology. It's like choose your own adventure. It puts you into a hypothetical scenario and then kind of guides you through application of that learning, gives you a little bit of information, and then it puts you into application.
Well, thank you so much, Karen,
Mm-hmm.
Julia, Audra, Felicia, Natalie, Eileen, Luke, Liz. I appreciate you all so much. I appreciate all of you who participated. I know your time is valuable, and many of you are just now bringing students back to school in California. So whether you're coming back or have been doing a hybrid model, I appreciate you giving us all your time. Any closing comments from the panel?
Thank you everyone for joining us in the afternoon.
Thank you.
So I will close this off with reminding you to visit the CA PBIS Coalition webpage, pbisca.org. You can get a copy of this webinar in a few days. It won't be up there immediately. It takes us a few days to get it up there. But you can right now go to the events page and get a copy of everybody's presentations from today. And don't forget about our in-person conference. We will be sending the call for papers here pretty quick in the next week or so. And with that, I will close us off for today. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Karen.